In 1874, Mississippi officials made a decision they believed would end a single man's rebellion in one afternoon. They gathered 100 paid bounty hunters, armed, mounted, and certain of victory, and sent them into the Delta to surround a 7-foot fugitive named Amos Dunbar, a man they described as too big to outrun, too broken to fight back. The hunters bragged openly about how they'd drag him out, how fast they'd split the reward, how the state would applaud them by sundown. But by sunrise, not one of those 100 men returned, not even the ones assigned to guard the escape routes. Their horses came back without riders. Their rifles were found snapped in half. Their bodies were never recovered. What happened inside that swamp? What did those men see when they closed in on the giant they thought couldn't touch them? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The axe bit deep into pine. Again, again, again. Amos Dunbar's shoulders moved like machinery. Steady, rhythmic, unstoppable. Sweat poured down his dark skin in rivers, soaking through the torn cotton shirt that barely stretched across his massive frame, 7 feet tall. Arms thick as fence posts, hands that could snap an axe handle if he forgot to be careful. He was always careful. The morning sun climbed over the tree line, turning the Mississippi Delta into a furnace. Heat shimmered above the stumps where men had already fallen. Amos kept chopping. The rhythm helped, kept his mind quiet, kept the memories at bay. But they came anyway. He remembered being 8 years old, standing on an auction block in Georgia. Remembered the way white men poked his arms, checked his teeth like he was livestock. Remembered his mother screaming his name as they dragged her in one direction and shoved him in another. He never saw her again. 30 years of enslavement followed. 30 years of watching people he loved worked to death, beaten to death, sold away. 30 years of learning that survival meant making yourself small inside, even when your body was built like a mountain. Then the war ended. Freedom came. For 3 beautiful months, Amos lived as a free man. He worked as a blacksmith in Natchez, saved money, slept in a bed he built himself, started to believe the nightmare was over. Then the local sheriff arrested him for vagrancy, walking down a road without proof of employment. The judge sentenced him to 1 year of labor, and the state leased him to the Redden Timber Company for $7 a month. Amos never saw a single cent of that money. The Redden camp was enslavement, with a different name. Same chains, same whips, same men dying in the heat, while overseers counted timber like it mattered more than human life. "Keep that pace, boy!" The voice cut through the morning heat. Overseer Clay Redden rode his horse between the work lines, a coiled bullwhip hanging from his saddle. Clay was a thin man with a scraggly beard and eyes like dirty ice. He wore a Confederate officer's hat, even though the war ended 9 years ago. Wore it like the South might rise again if he just believed hard enough. "Yes, sir," Amos said quietly. He lifted the axe again. Clay moved on, shouting at the next man in line. Amos glanced sideways at the prisoner working 10 feet away. Elijah Pike, a wiry carpenter from Vicksburg, arrested for loitering outside a church where he'd been hired to repair the steps. Elijah had a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him. He talked about them sometimes during the brief minutes they had to rest. Elijah stumbled. His axe slipped. He caught himself on a tree trunk, breathing hard. His dark skin had turned grayish. Sweat didn't pour off him anymore. His body had nothing left to give. Amos opened his mouth to warn him. "Get back to work. Clay's watching. Too late." The bullwhip cracked across Elijah's shoulders. Elijah screamed and fell to his knees. "Lazy!" Clay shouted. "Worthless! Get up!" The whip came down again. Again. Blood soaked through Elijah's shirt. Amos's hands tightened on the axe handle. The wood creaked. "Be careful. Stay quiet." survive. That's what he always did. That's what kept him alive. But watching Elijah try to stand on shaking legs, watching him collapse again while Clay laughed, something shifted deep inside Amos's chest. Something he'd kept locked down for 30 years. He wanted to move, wanted to cross those 10 feet and break Clay Redden in half. Instead, Amos forced himself to keep chopping. The axe felt heavier now. Each swing took effort, like he was cutting through iron instead of wood. Noon came. The prisoners shuffled toward the shade where tin cups of water and cornmeal mush waited. Amos helped Elijah walk, supporting the smaller man's weight with one arm. "I'm all right," Elijah whispered. His voice shook. "I'm all right." "You need rest," Amos said. "Can't rest. They'll kill me if I slow down again." Amos said nothing. They both knew it was true. Near the water barrels, a woman in a faded gray dress moved between the prisoners, checking injuries. Sarah Bethune. She'd been a Union Army nurse during the war, one of the few white women who treated black soldiers like human beings. After the war, she'd stayed in Mississippi to run a clinic for freed people. Then Clay's brother got shot during a bar fight. Sarah saved his life. And Clay decided the camp needed a healer, someone to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract every ounce of labor before they died. Sarah wasn't a prisoner officially, but she couldn't leave either. Clay made that clear. She knelt beside Elijah now, examining the whip marks across his back. Her hands were gentle. Her face stayed calm. But Amos saw the anger in her eyes. "This needs cleaning," she said quietly. "Come to my tent tonight." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah looked up at Amos. "And you? Any injuries?" "No, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment. Amos wondered what she saw. A giant? A weapon? Or just another man trapped in a nightmare that never ended? Before Sarah could speak again, voices drifted from the overseer's shack. Clay and 2 other guards, Miller and Shaw, sat in the shade, drinking whiskey and laughing. Amos's sharp ears caught fragments of their conversation. Too weak to be worth feeding. Work the weak ones to death and replace them next week. Plenty more, where they came from. Amos's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles went pale. They were talking about human beings like they were tools. Use them up, throw them away, get new ones. Elijah Pike had a wife, had daughters. The man next to him, Thomas, had a son learning to read. The woman carrying water buckets, Ruth, had a mother waiting for her in Tennessee. They all had names, had families, had lives that mattered. But to Clay Redden and men like him, they were just bodies to be worked until they broke. Sundown came too fast. The prisoners dragged themselves back to the work lines for the final 2 hours of labor. Amos's axe rose and fell. His muscles screamed, but he kept the rhythm steady. Survive. Just survive one more day. A shout echoed across the clearing. "No! Please!" Amos turned. His stomach dropped. Clay stood over Thomas, the older man who worked near the cook tent. Thomas lay on the ground, clutching his chest, gasping for air. His lips had turned blue. "Get up," Clay said. "Can't breathe," Thomas wheezed. "I said get up." Clay kicked him in the ribs. Thomas curled into a ball, choking. Sarah ran toward them. "He's having a heart episode. He needs to get back to work," Clay snapped. He drew his pistol and cocked the hammer. "I'm done wasting food on useless mouths." The clearing went silent. Every prisoner froze. Every guard watched. Amos stood 20 feet away. He could stay still, could let it happen, could survive another day by doing nothing. Thomas looked up at him. Their eyes met. The old man wasn't asking for help. He'd already accepted his death. But something in that look, some quiet dignity, some refusal to beg, broke through every wall Amos had built inside himself. "Step aside, boy," Clay said, aiming the pistol at Thomas's head. Amos stepped forward instead. "What did you say?" Clay's voice went cold. I said no. Amos's voice was soft, calm, but it carried across the clearing like thunder. You ain't killing him. Clay's face twisted with rage. You giving me orders, boy? I'm telling you. Amos moved closer. You ain't killing him. Clay swung the pistol toward Amos. I'll put you down like a... Amos's hand shot out. He moved faster than a man his size should be able to move. His massive fist closed around Clay's wrist and squeezed. Bones cracked like kindling. Clay screamed. The pistol fell from his shattered hand. For one frozen second, everyone stared. Then Miller and Shaw grabbed their rifles. Amos didn't think, didn't plan. 30 years of rage and grief and suffering erupted all at once. He grabbed Clay by the throat with one hand and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Clay's feet kicked uselessly in the air. His face turned purple. Stop! Miller aimed his rifle. Put him down, or... Amos threw Clay at Miller. Both men crashed into the dirt in a tangle of limbs. Shaw fired. The bullet whined past Amos's ear. Amos crossed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. Shaw tried to reload. Too slow. Amos's fist caught him in the jaw with a sound like splitting wood. Shaw crumpled and didn't move. Miller scrambled for his fallen rifle. Amos kicked it away, then grabbed Miller by the collar and slammed him into the ground so hard the man's eyes rolled back. Clay tried to crawl away, wheezing, clutching his ruined throat. Amos stood over him. The overseer who'd whipped Elijah, who'd starved Thomas, who'd kept dozens of innocent people in chains and laughed while they suffered. Please, Clay rasped. Amos raised his boot and brought it down. Once. Silence fell over the camp like a blanket. Amos looked around. Every prisoner stared at him with wide eyes. Some looked terrified. Others looked hopeful. A few looked like they might finally believe freedom was possible. The lock shed, Amos said. His voice was steady now, calm, like he'd finally found something he was meant to do. Someone get me a sledgehammer. 15 minutes later, chains lay broken in the dirt. Prisoners stood in the clearing, rubbing raw wrists, barely believing they were free. Sarah appeared at Amos's side. They'll come for us. The state. The governor. Everyone. I know. Amos looked at the camp, at the tools of torture scattered everywhere. Then he walked to the overseer's shack and kicked over a lantern. Flames caught quickly. Fire spread across the dry wood, climbing toward the roof. Anyone who wants to come with me, Amos called out. We leave now. Anyone who wants to take their chances alone, I understand. But we move fast, and we move quiet. Elijah stepped forward first, then Thomas, still clutching his chest but standing, then Ruth, then others. Sarah hesitated. I'm white. I'll slow you down. You saved lives here, Amos said. You're one of us. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Amos led them into the swamp as night fell. Behind them, the camp burned bright against the darkening sky, a beacon visible for miles. Amos looked back once at the flames. He'd killed 3 men tonight, destroyed property worth thousands of dollars, freed prisoners the state considered its legal property. Mississippi would come for him with everything it had. But for the first time in 30 years, Amos Dunbar wasn't afraid. He was done surviving. Now he would fight. Morning light filtered through Spanish moss, turning the swamp into a cathedral of green and gold. Sarah knelt beside a fallen cypress log, unwrapping strips of torn fabric from Elijah's back. The whip marks had opened again during the night march. This will sting, she warned. Elijah nodded. He didn't make a sound when she cleaned the wounds with water boiled over a carefully concealed fire. Around them, other freed prisoners rested in the hidden thicket, a natural depression surrounded by thick palmetto and cypress knees that made it nearly invisible from 20 feet away. Sarah had organized them into shifts. Some slept. Others kept watch. A few helped her prepare poultices from plants she recognized from her time treating soldiers in field hospital. Thomas sat nearby, breathing easier now. Ruth brought him water in a tin cup salvaged from the camp. The older man's hands shook as he drank. "Where's Amos?" Elijah asked. "Scouting," Sarah said. She tied off the bandage and moved to the next patient, a young woman named Hannah whose ankle had twisted during the escape. "He left before dawn. He always this quiet?" "Yes." Elijah studied Sarah's face. "You trust him?" Sarah paused. She thought about the way Amos had lifted Clay off the ground like he weighed nothing. The sound of bone breaking, the cold precision in his movements when he'd destroyed 3 armed men in less than a minute. But she also remembered how gently he'd helped Elijah walk, how carefully he'd checked on Thomas after the old man collapsed, how he'd insisted she come with them even though her presence made escape harder. "I trust him," she said finally. 10 miles away, Sheriff Luther Barlow stood in the ruins of the lease site and stared at Clay Redden's body. The overseer's skull was caved in. His throat was crushed, his wrist bent at an impossible angle. Barlow had seen men killed in bar fights, lynchings, and war. But this was something else. This was rage given physical form. "Sweet Jesus," one of his deputies whispered. "Get Miller and Shaw to the doctor," Barlow ordered. Both guards were alive but barely conscious. "And send riders to every town within 50 miles. I want descriptions posted by noon." "What description, Sheriff? We got 3 witnesses saying different things. Miller claims it was a monster. Shaw won't stop shaking. The cook said—" "7 feet tall," Barlow interrupted. "Black, built like an ox, answers to Amos Dunbar." He kicked at a broken chain. "And extremely dangerous." By mid-morning, the plantation owners arrived. 5 men in expensive suits, who owned most of the county between them. They stood in a semicircle around Barlow, their faces tight with barely controlled fury. "This is an insurrection," one said. His name was Whitmore, and he owned 2,000 acres of cotton fields. "We need the militia." "Already sent word to the governor," Barlow replied. "That's not enough." Another owner, Cunningham, stepped forward. "You know what this looks like? A numb killed white men and freed our labor. If we don't respond with overwhelming force, every freed person in Mississippi will think they can do the same." Barlow understood the real fear beneath the anger. These men had built fortunes on the convict leasing system. They rented prisoners from the state for pennies a day and worked them harder than any slave owner ever dared. Because if a leased convict died, they just got another one. No property loss, no financial risk. Amos had destroyed thousands of dollars of their investment in a single night. "What do you propose?" Barlow asked. "A bounty," Whitmore said. "Big enough to bring every hunter between here and Tennessee." "How big?" $5,000. Barlow whistled low. That was more money than most men saw in 10 years. "The governor will approve it," Cunningham added. "He's already drafting the order. We'll have it posted by tomorrow." "And what happens when we catch him?" The plantation owners exchanged glances. Whitmore spoke carefully. "We need him alive long enough to make an example. Public hanging. Maximum humiliation. Make sure every black person in the state understands what happens to troublemakers." Barlow nodded slowly. He'd seen this before. The calculated cruelty meant to terrorize entire communities into submission. It had worked during slavery. It worked now. "I'll coordinate with the hunters," he said. By afternoon, Amos led the group deeper into the delta. They moved in single file, stepping where he stepped, avoiding dry branches that might snap. He'd learned this kind of travel during his childhood, when running away from the plantation meant knowing how to disappear. He taught them as they walked. "Step on the moss-covered stones," he said quietly. "They don't leave prints. When we cross water, spread out. Don't follow the same path. If you hear dogs, don't run. Move to water, and stay still. Dogs track movement as much as scent. Sarah walked near the middle of the line, helping those who struggled. Thomas leaned on Ruth's shoulder. Hannah limped, but kept pace. Elijah carried supplies salvaged from the camp. They weren't soldiers, weren't trained. Most had been farmers, craftsmen, or house servants before false arrests destroyed their lives. But they were learning. Amos found a spot where 3 fallen cypress trees formed a natural shelter. He showed them how to weave palmetto fronds into walls that shed rain. He demonstrated how to dig shallow pits that collected clean water from underground springs. And when darkness fell, he began crafting traps. He used chains from the broken shackles, wrapping them around saplings bent into tension. He positioned fallen logs over narrow paths, held in place by carefully balanced stones. He dug pits and covered them with branches and leaves. "What are these for?" Elijah asked, watching. Amos didn't answer immediately. He tested the tension on a chain snare, making sure it would release with the right pressure. "Insurance," he said finally. By the 3rd day, word of the bounty spread like wildfire. In taverns and trading posts across Mississippi, men studied the posted notices. $5,000, enough to buy land, start a business, live comfortably for years. Ex-Confederate soldiers saw it as a chance to relive old glories. Drifters saw it as their ticket out of poverty. Professional hunters saw it as the biggest payday of their lives. They came from every direction. Some traveled alone. Others formed groups. By the end of the week, nearly 100 men had gathered in the Delta, following reports of tracks, broken branches, and abandoned campsites. They set up a temporary camp at the old lease site, shared information, planned strategy. A former Confederate captain named Morrison took unofficial command. He'd fought in the Wilderness Campaign and knew how to coordinate large groups over difficult terrain. "We form a net," he explained, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. 3 groups moving in from different directions. Force them toward the river. Cut off escape routes. Someone will flush them out. The hunters listened. They cleaned rifles, sharpened knives, checked ammunition. They were confident. After all, how dangerous could one man be, even a giant, against 100 armed hunters? At dusk on the 7th day, Amos crouched at the edge of a clearing and listened. Dogs barking in the distance, men calling to each other, the metallic click of rifles being loaded. They were close now. Very close. He looked back toward the thicket where Sarah and the others hid. He could still hear Thomas's wheezing cough, could still smell the smoke from their carefully concealed fire. The hunters would find them eventually. Maybe not tonight, but soon. Amos made his decision. He found Sarah preparing evening medicine. "Get everyone deeper into the swamp," he said quietly. "Follow the moss-marked trees I showed you. There's high ground 3 miles east. What about you?" "I'm going to draw them away." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Amos, there are too many. You can't." "I can." He looked at her steadily. "And I will. They'll kill you. Maybe." He pulled his arm free gently. "But they won't kill you. Not if they're chasing me." He didn't wait for her response. Didn't say goodbye to the others. Just turned and walked toward the clearing as the last light faded from the sky. Behind him, Sarah began quietly waking the sleepers and gathering supplies. Ahead, lanterns flickered to life in a wide circle. Amos counted them. 20, 30, 40. More appearing every second as hunters tightened their net. He stepped into the clearing alone. The lanterns moved closer, forming a ring of light around him. Men emerged from the tree line, faces hard, rifles ready, eyes gleaming with greed. Amos stood perfectly still in the center, waiting. A voice called out from the darkness. "Amos Dunbar, you're surrounded. Surrender, and we'll take you alive." Amos said nothing. More lanterns, more men. The circle tightened. Amos counted silently. 60, 70, 80. Nearly 100 men, just like Morrison planned. He flexed his hands, felt the weight of the chains wrapped around his forearms beneath his shirt sleeves, remembered the positions of every trap he'd set in the surrounding forest. The voice called again. "Last chance, boy! Drop to your knees, or we open fire." Amos took a slow breath, let it out, and then he smiled. A cold, terrible smile that made the nearest hunters take an involuntary step backward. "No," Amos said quietly. The forest held its breath. Morrison stepped forward, boots crunching on dry leaves. He carried rope coiled over his shoulder and a pistol loose in his grip. His confidence came from numbers. 100 armed men against one. "Smart choice," Morrison said. "On your knees, hands behind your head." Amos didn't move. Morrison's smile faded. "I said—" Amos took one deliberate step backward, his heel pressed down on a buried trigger stick. The sound started small. A crack, then a groan of wood under tension. Morrison's eyes widened as he looked up just in time to see the massive cypress log swing down from the canopy on vine ropes Amos had spent 3 days preparing. The log caught Morrison mid-chest and carried him backward into 5 hunters behind him. Bones snapped like dry kindling. Men screamed. The lanterns scattered as bodies hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Hunters raised rifles, but hesitated, afraid of hitting each other in the confusion. Amos moved before they could reorganize. He covered the distance to the nearest man in 3 huge strides, grabbed the rifle barrel, and twisted. The hunter's finger caught in the trigger guard and broke with a wet pop. Amos reversed the rifle and drove the stock into another hunter's throat, crushing his windpipe. "Spread out!" someone yelled. "Surround him!" They tried. 20 men rushed forward from the eastern side of the clearing, while others circled to flank. But Amos had walked this ground for days. He knew every route, every depression, every trap. He ran toward the eastern group, not away, but directly at them. The hunters raised weapons. 3 shots cracked out, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. One bullet grazed Amos's shoulder. Another missed entirely. The third ricocheted off a chain wrapped beneath his shirt. Amos hit the line of hunters like a falling tree. His fist connected with the first man's jaw, and the hunter's head snapped back at an impossible angle. Amos caught the second by the collar and used him as a shield against rifle fire before throwing the body into 2 others. A hunter lunged with a knife. Amos caught his wrist, twisted until the elbow inverted, and drove the knife back into its owner's chest. He pulled it free and threw it in a single fluid motion. The blade buried itself in another hunter's eye socket, 20 feet away. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "Shoot him! Just shoot!" More rifles fired. Amos dove behind the fallen cypress log where Morrison's broken body lay. Bullets chewed into the wood. Splinters exploded around him. He waited for the pause, the moment when they had to reload. Then he stood and hurled a section of chain like a whip. The improvised weapon wrapped around a hunter's neck, and Amos yanked hard. The man flew forward, crashed face first into the log, and went still. Amos was already moving again, circling left where the ground sloped downward. 3 hunters followed, emboldened by their numbers. The first stepped directly into a pit Amos had dug and covered with branches. He fell 8 feet onto sharpened stakes made from broken axe handles. His scream cut off abruptly. The second hunter froze, staring down at his dying companion. Amos grabbed him from behind, wrapped both massive hands around his head, and twisted. The crack echoed through the trees. The third tried to run, made it 5 steps before a snare trap. Chain wound around a bent sapling, caught his ankle and yanked him upward. He hung upside down, swinging, screaming. Amos walked over and silenced him with a single punch to the temple. On the far side of the clearing, Sarah and Elijah worked in the darkness with Thomas and Hannah. They didn't engage the hunters directly. Instead, they cut the horses loose, scattered saddles, and blocked the narrow paths leading out of the forest. Every escape route sealed, every mount driven away. The hunters were trapped just as surely as Amos had been in chains. "Fall back!" someone shouted. "Regroup at—" Amos found the speaker and threw a rock the size of a man's fist. It hit with enough force to cave in the hunter's skull. The body crumpled. The remaining hunters, maybe 60 now, maybe fewer, tried to form a defensive line. They fired in volleys, hoping concentrated gunfire would bring Amos down. But he used the terrain, the darkness, the confusion, appeared from unexpected angles, struck and vanished before they could aim. A hunter with a shotgun managed to get close, fired both barrels from 10 feet away. The blast caught Amos in the side, but the chains beneath his clothes absorbed most of the impact. Pellets embedded in wood and metal instead of flesh. Amos grabbed the shotgun, pulled the hunter off balance, and broke his neck with his forearm. "He ain't human," someone wailed. "He's a demon. Run! Just run!" But there was nowhere to run. Every path led to traps, to blocked passages, to Sarah and Elijah and the others standing silent in the darkness with axes and stolen rifles, turning hunters back toward the center where Amos waited. A group of 15 tried to break through the western edge. They ran desperately, abandoning weapons, abandoning wounded companions. Amos pursued. His long legs covered ground faster than their panic-driven sprint. He caught the last man, used his body as a battering ram to knock down 3 others, then moved through them with methodical efficiency. Fists breaking ribs, fingers crushing throats, boots stomping down on knees until they shattered. By midnight, the shooting stopped. The screaming became whimpering, then silence. Amos stood in the center of the clearing, breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't entirely his own. Bodies lay scattered in every direction, some caught in traps, some broken by direct violence, some who'd tried to run and failed. He counted. 97. Maybe more in the darkness. None alive enough to walk. None capable of riding for help. Sarah emerged from the tree line with the others. They stared at the carnage, at Amos standing alone amid the dead, and no one spoke. Finally, Elijah found his voice. "What now?" Amos looked north, where freedom supposedly waited, where they could scatter and hide and hope the world forgot. But the world never forgot. The world kept coming. The world had already shown it would send 100 men, then 100 more, then 1,000. "We don't run," Amos said quietly. "Then what?" "We build something." Amos turned to face them. "Hidden, permanent, somewhere they can't reach us." "A settlement?" Sarah asked. "A home," Amos corrected. "Our home." Thomas coughed but nodded. Hannah took Ruth's hand. Elijah straightened despite his exhaustion. "Where?" Sarah asked. "Deeper," Amos said. "Where the swamp is thickest, where no one goes because they think it's too dangerous." He almost smiled. Let them keep thinking that. They gathered what supplies the hunters had brought. Food, ammunition, tools, blankets, took weapons and medical supplies, left the bodies where they fell. As sunrise broke golden through the cypress canopy, Amos led the group deeper into the delta. They walked single file through knee-deep water, through morning mist that clung to their clothes, through territory no map showed because no surveyor had ever survived to chart it. Behind them, the first buzzards descended in lazy circles. Ahead, Amos whispered to Sarah, "We'll build something the world cannot crush." She believed him. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to hope. The morning sun broke pale and thin through the cypress canopy. Amos waded through waist-deep water, testing the ground ahead with a long stick. Behind him, the others followed in silence, too exhausted for questions, too traumatized for complaints. Their clothes hung heavy with marsh water, Their faces carried the blank expression of people who'd witnessed something that broke normal understanding. Sarah kept close to Ruth, one hand on the girl's shoulder. Thomas coughed quietly, but kept moving. Elijah carried an armload of salvage tools wrapped in canvas. Josiah, the old preacher, muttered prayers under his breath. They walked for 3 hours before Amos stopped. "Here," he said. The landscape looked no different from the miles they'd already crossed. Water, moss, tangled roots. But Amos had seen something the others missed. A slight elevation, maybe 15 feet higher than the surrounding swamp. Not quite an island, but solid enough to hold structures. Dense growth provided natural cover. Multiple water channels offered escape routes. "Start clearing that brush," Amos told Elijah, "but leave the outer layer untouched. We need to stay hidden from a distance." Elijah nodded and set down his tools. "How big? Big enough for 20 people? Maybe 30 eventually. And if more come? Then we build outward," Amos said. "But careful, everything camouflaged." They worked through the day. Sarah gathered moss and dry wood for fires. Amos showed her how to build a Dakota fire pit. 2 holes connected underground, so the flame stayed below ground level and smoke dispersed invisibly through root systems. The heat rose without giving away their position. Elijah proved himself immediately. His carpenter's hands moved with practiced efficiency, measuring distances by eye, testing wood grain with his fingertips. Within hours, he'd constructed a frame for the first shelter using fallen cypress and stripped bark for binding. He built low to the ground, angled the roof to shed rain into collection barrels, positioned supports to bear weight without nails that might rust or squeak. "You've done this before," Sarah observed. "Built cabins for my master," Elijah said quietly. "Never for myself." By afternoon, Thomas and 2 other former prisoners had dug storage pits lined with clay to keep supplies dry. They worked slowly, coughing frequently, but refused to rest. Hannah organized what little food they had: dried meat from the hunter's supplies, some cornmeal, wild mushrooms Sarah identified as safe. Josiah gathered everyone at sundown. His white hair caught the last light filtering through the trees. He raised his weathered hands and spoke in a voice that carried calm authority. "We stand here by grace," he said. "Not luck, not accident. Grace, the same grace that brought Moses through the Red Sea, the same grace that brought Harriet through the woods, the same grace that brought our brother Amos to that clearing when we needed him most." Some of the group murmured agreement. Others just listened, desperate for words that made sense of the violence. "We built things before," Josiah continued, "for masters, for overseers, for men who beat us when we worked slow and beat us when we worked fast. But now," he gestured at the rising shelters, the organized supplies, the purposeful activity. "Now we build for ourselves, for each other, and that makes this place holy." Amos stood apart, watching. He'd never been comfortable with religion. Too many preachers had told enslaved people to accept suffering as God's plan, but Josiah was different. His faith didn't demand submission. It demanded survival. Over the following days, the settlement took shape. Elijah built 3 more shelters, each one better than the last. He designed them to blend into the landscape. Roofs covered in living moss, walls the same gray-brown as cypress bark. From 50 feet away, they looked like natural formations. Sarah established a medical station in the most protected shelter. She inventoried their supplies: bandages made from torn cloth, needles and thread from the hunter's saddlebags, whiskey for disinfecting wounds. She found wild feverfew growing near the water's edge and harvested it for pain relief, willow bark for inflammation, cattail roots for poultices. 2 former Union soldiers, Marcus and James, set up observation posts at the cardinal points. They'd served in the colored troops during the war and understood military tactics. They taught the others how to read the forest, how to distinguish animal sounds from human movement, how to communicate with bird calls. Amos built the watchtower himself. He selected a dead cypress that still stood 40 feet tall, its trunk hollowed by rot but structurally sound. He carved handholds inside the trunk and constructed a platform at the top, concealed beneath the tree's remaining crown. From up there, a lookout could see for miles without being seen. He also prepared defenses, sharpened stakes hidden beneath the water's surface along approach routes, trip lines connected to warning bells made from tin cans, false trails leading to sinkholes. He worked methodically, never rushing, building layers of protection the way a spider builds a web. Meanwhile, 30 miles north, Sheriff Barlow stood in the clearing where the hunters had died. His face had gone gray. His deputy vomited into the bushes. Bodies lay everywhere, some caught in traps, some crushed, some broken in ways that didn't seem possible. The sheriff counted 43 clearly visible. His men found more scattered through the surrounding forest. "Sweet Jesus," Barlow whispered. His deputy wiped his mouth. "What kind of man does this?" "Not a man." Barlow turned away from the carnage. "A monster, and we poked it with a stick." They rode hard back to the county seat and went directly to the telegraph office. The message went straight to the governor's desk in Jackson. Governor Horace Barrow read the report twice. Then he locked his office door and drafted a new order. This one marked confidential, never to appear in any official record. He authorized the formation of a special unit. Not bounty hunters, not local law enforcement. A paramilitary force led by men who understood warfare. Men who'd fought for the Confederacy and lost everything when the South fell. Men hungry for a chance to restore their damaged pride. Colonel Merrick Vance received the appointment personally. He'd commanded guerrilla operations during the war, burning supply lines, ambushing Union patrols, terrorizing sympathizers. Now the governor offered him an opportunity disguised as duty. "Crush this insurrection," Barrow said. "Use whatever methods necessary." Vance smiled for the first time in years. "Yes, sir." That evening, as twilight settled over the hidden settlement, Sarah made her rounds checking on the sick. Thomas's cough had worsened slightly, but he refused to rest. Ruth helped Hannah prepare the evening meal. Josiah led prayers in the central clearing. Sarah walked the outer perimeter, checking water levels and looking for signs of animals. She found boot prints pressed into the soft mud near a fallen log. Fresh prints, multiple sets. Her breath caught. She returned to camp and found Amos reinforcing the watchtower's ladder. "We have visitors," she said quietly. Amos followed her back to the prints. He knelt and studied them carefully, measuring the depth, the spacing between steps, the pattern of movement. His expression hardened. "These aren't hunters," he said. "How do you know?" "The formation." Amos traced the prints with his finger. "See how they moved? Staggered intervals, overlapping fields of vision. That's military training." Sarah felt cold, despite the humid air. "Soldiers? Former soldiers." Amos stood and scanned the darkening tree line. "Men who know how to fight coordinated battles." "How many?" "Can't tell yet. But enough to scout in formation means enough to attack in force." He looked back toward the settlement, where smoke from the Dakota fire pits rose invisibly, where children laughed, and Josiah's voice carried evening blessings, where people had finally started to believe they might be safe. "The real fight is coming," Amos said. Dawn came gray and heavy. Amos gathered everyone in the central clearing before the mist burned off. 23 faces looked up at him. Men, women, 3 children. Some still bore scars from the leasing camps. All of them carried the exhaustion of people who'd been running their entire lives. "We have company coming," Amos said. His voice stayed level and calm. "Not hunters this time. Soldiers. Trained men who know how to track and kill." Hannah's hand went to her daughter's shoulder. Thomas stopped coughing long enough to ask, "How long we got?" "Days. Maybe a week if we're lucky." Josiah stepped forward. "Then we run again?" "No." Amos shook his head. "We've built something here. We defend it." Marcus exchanged glances with James. Both men had fought in the war and understood what Amos was proposing. "Against how many?" Marcus asked. "Don't know yet, but enough to track information. Enough to feel confident." "We ain't soldiers," Elijah said quietly. "Neither were most men who fought," James replied. "We'll teach you what we can." Sarah moved to Amos's side. "What do you need from us?" "Everything." Amos turned and pointed toward the northern approach. "We fortify every path. Make the groundwork for us instead of them. Marcus and James will drill anyone strong enough to hold a weapon. Sarah, you prepare the medical station for casualty. Josiah, you keep people's spirits steady. And Elijah, I know," Elijah said. "Build faster." They scattered to their tasks. Amos led a group to the main pathways leading into their territory. He showed them how to create false trails that looked recently used but led to dead ends or sinkholes, how to weave branches back across real paths so they appeared impassable, how to position markers only they would recognize. "Water's your best weapon in a swamp," Amos explained as they worked. "Most men from cities don't know how to read it. They see a solid-looking surface and trust it." He demonstrated by stepping onto what looked like firm ground. His boot sank 6 inches into hidden mud beneath a thin crust of moss and algae. "Dig out the solid bottom. Replace it with soft sediment. Cover it again. Looks safe until someone's knee-deep and stuck." They worked through the morning, creating dozens of traps along the likely approach route. Sharpened stakes angled to catch horses and men. Trip lines connected to deadfalls. Narrow channels where the water ran faster than it appeared, strong enough to sweep a man off his feet. 20 miles north, Colonel Merrick Vance stood in the smoking ruins of a small black community. His men had burned 3 homes and arrested 5 men for questioning. The women and children huddled together, watching as soldiers tore through their possessions. Vance approached an older man, held between 2 guards. "You know where they went?" he said. Not a question. "Don't know nothing," the man replied. Vance nodded to his sergeant. The sergeant drove his rifle butt into the man's stomach. He doubled over, gasping. "The escaped prisoners," Vance continued. "The giant who killed those hunters. Where did they go?" "Swamp." The man coughed. "That's all I heard. Deep swamp somewhere. Which direction?" "South, maybe southeast. I swear that's all I know." Vance studied him for a long moment, then waved his hand. The guards released the man, who collapsed to his knees. "Burn the church," Vance told his sergeant. "Let them remember what happens when they protect criminals." They moved to the next settlement that afternoon. Same questions, same methods. Some people answered immediately, terrified. Others stayed silent until violence convinced them. Vance collected fragments of information like puzzle pieces, directions, rumors, distances. His tracker, a lean man named Davies, who'd hunted deserters during the war, examined torn clothing found near a creek. 2 days old, Davies said. "Maybe 3. Large group moving careful." Vance nodded. "Gather the men. We enter the swamp tomorrow." That night, his unit made camp on solid ground at the swamp's edge. 42 men total. Former Confederate cavalry, infantry, sharpshooters, men who'd fought losing battles and wanted a victory to restore their pride. They checked their weapons, sharpened knives, prepared gear for marshy terrain. Vance walked the perimeter and felt satisfaction settle in his chest. This wasn't war. This was pest control. One oversized slave and a handful of desperate followers hiding in mud. He'd crush them, bring their bodies back as proof, and remind the state that some men still knew how to maintain order. Back at the settlement, Sarah found Amos sitting alone near the watchtower. He stared north, toward the communities he knew were suffering. "It's my fault," he said when she sat beside him. "Those families, those burned homes, they're paying for what I did." "No." Sarah's voice carried steel. "They're paying for what the system does. Same system that put you in chains. Same system that arrested innocent men on false charges. Same system that worked people to death for profit. I broke it. I made it angry. It was already angry. It was always angry." She touched his arm. "You just refused to die quietly like they wanted. That's not causing the violence. That's refusing to accept it." Amos looked at her. "People are burning because of me." People were already burning, just slower. In leasing camps, on chain gangs, at the end of ropes. Sarah's eyes held his. "You gave some of them a chance to live free, even if it's just for a while. That matters, does it? If they come here and kill everyone? Yes. No hesitation, because even one day of freedom is worth fighting for. And you know that's true, or you wouldn't have built this place." Amos didn't reply. He turned back to watch in the darkness. The next morning, Vance's unit entered the swamp. They moved in organized columns, weapons ready, bloodhounds straining at their leashes. Davies led from the front, reading signs invisible to less experienced eyes. Broken branches, disturbed mud, the faint chemical smell of human waste. Progress came slow but steady. The dogs pulled them southeast, following scent trails days old but still detectable. Vance ordered regular halts to prevent exhaustion and maintain formation. Professional, methodical, inevitable. At the settlement, daily routine continued, but tension wound tighter. Marcus drilled defenders in basic formations: how to hold a line, how to reload under pressure, how to retreat without panicking. James taught knife work to anyone willing to learn. Children practiced running evacuation routes. Elijah built barricades that looked like natural debris. Hannah stockpiled food and water in hidden caches. Josiah led prayers twice daily, his voice growing stronger as fear grew sharper. Sarah prepared the medical station with grim efficiency. She boiled water, arranged bandages, sharpened her surgical tools. She hoped she wouldn't need them, but knew better than to rely on hope. Amos checked every defense personally. He walked each false trail, tested every trap, memorized exact positions so he could fight blind if necessary. He studied the terrain the way other men studied scripture, looking for advantages, finding strength in details. That night, he climbed to the watchtower for his shift. The moon rose full and bright, turning the swamp silver. For an hour, nothing moved except wind through moss. Then he saw them, distant lanterns, moving in organized patterns through the trees, sweeping back and forth in search formations, maybe 2 miles out, maybe less. Amos counted the lights. 8 visible, which meant more hidden in darkness. His hands tightened on the platform's edge. They'd found the general area. Tomorrow, they'd find the settlement itself. He climbed down and woke Sarah quietly. "They're here," he whispered. Sarah followed Amos to the central clearing where the others already waited. Dawn light filtered through moss, painting everything pale green. 37 people gathered in silence, men, women, children old enough to understand danger. Their faces showed fear, but also determination. They'd chosen to stay. Amos stood before them. "They're close. Maybe a day out. Maybe less." He pointed to a crude map scratched in dirt. "They'll come from the north, where the ground's firmest. That's what trained soldiers do. Find the path of least resistance." Marcus nodded. "So we make that path the most dangerous." "Exactly." Amos traced lines in the dirt. "We've got 3 main approaches they might use. We fortify all 3, but we make the northern route look safest. Clear some brush. Pack down some mud. Make them think that's the smart choice." James crouched beside the map. "And when they take it? Every 10 yards, something goes wrong. A sinkhole, a tripwire, stakes hidden in tall grass. Nothing fatal at first, just enough to slow them down and make them bunch up. Amos marked positions with small stones. Then we hit them here, where the path narrows between two deep pools. What about retreat routes? Marcus asked. 3 of them, marked with red cloth strips only we know to look for. Sarah's medical station sits at the center point where all 3 routes converge. Anyone wounded gets pulled back there. Sarah stepped forward. I'll need runners. Young, fast, able to move between positions. 2 teenage boys volunteered immediately. Elijah's son Thomas and another named Peter. Sarah looked at their mothers, who nodded reluctant permission. You don't fight, Sarah told them firmly. You carry messages and help move injured people, that's all. Understood? Yes, ma'am, they said together. Amos continued outlining the plan. Positions for each defender. Rotation schedules so no one stayed exposed too long. Silent signals using bird calls. 1 for enemies spotted, 2 for retreat, 3 for medical emergency. They practiced the calls until even the children could distinguish them. Remember, Amos said, we're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to make them give up. Make it cost too much. Make them think twice about pushing deeper. The meeting ended and work began immediately. Amos led teams to each defensive position, showing them exactly what needed doing. At the northern approach, they cleared brush carefully, making the path look naturally passable. Then they dug pits every dozen yards, covering them with thin layers of sticks and moss. Test weight, Amos instructed. He placed a log across one pit. It held firm. Good. Should support up to about 40 pounds. Enough for it to look safe. But a full-grown man steps on it. He pushed down with his boot. The covering collapsed, revealing a 4-foot hole filled with cold water and soft mud. Not deep enough to drown, but enough to trap someone knee-deep while their companions panicked. They built 24 such pits along the northern route. At key points, Amos positioned sharpened stakes angled toward approaching enemies, not where they'd be immediately visible, but where someone stumbling backward from a pit would fall. Marcus and James worked with the defenders who'd actually hold the line. Most had never fired a weapon. A few had hunting experience. The 2 Union veterans taught basic rifle handling, how to load, how to aim, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. Don't try to be a hero, Marcus said. Fire your shot, reload, fire again. If they get close, fall back to the next position. We're not holding ground, we're making them pay for every inch. They practiced until fingers bled from ramming bullets home, until shoulders bruised from recoil, until the movements became almost automatic. Meanwhile, Sarah organized the medical station in a reinforced shelter near the settlement's center. She arranged supplies on makeshift tables, bandages made from torn cloth, whiskey for disinfecting wounds, needle and thread for stitching, a saw for amputations if necessary. Hannah helped her prepare clean water and extra blankets. You really think it'll come to this? Hannah asked quietly. I know it will. Sarah tested the sharpness of her scalpel. I've seen what bullets do to bodies, what knives do, what happens when bones break. She looked at Hannah. I can save some of them. Not all, but some. 2 days passed in careful preparation. Vance's scouts probed the outer perimeter, searching for the settlement's location. 3 scouts entered the swamp at different points. One stepped into a hidden pit and had to be pulled out by his companions, emerging furious and mud-covered. Another triggered a tripwire that released a counterweighted log, missing his head by inches, but spooking him badly enough that he retreated immediately. The 3rd scout pushed deeper. He moved carefully, checking his footing, avoiding obvious dangers. He got within half a mile of the settlement before James spotted him from a concealed position. James didn't shoot. Instead, he signaled the others. They captured the scout alive using a net trap. Simple rope webbing dropped from above when he passed beneath. He fought and cursed as they dragged him to the settlement's edge, bound his hands, and brought him before Amos. "How many?" Amos asked. The scout spat at his feet. Amos didn't hit him, didn't threaten, just waited with infinite patience until the silence became unbearable. 40, the scout finally said. 40 men with rifles and military training. Colonel Vance leads them. He's not like those hunters you killed. He's a real soldier. When do they attack? Tomorrow. Maybe the day after. Soon as we map your defenses. Amos nodded. You can go. The scout looked confused. What? Go. Run back to your colonel. Tell him what you saw. Amos cut the ropes binding his wrists. Tell him we're ready. They released him at dusk. He stumbled north, glancing back repeatedly as if expecting a bullet. When he disappeared into darkness, Marcus approached Amos. Why let him go? Because now Vance knows we're not running. He knows we're dug in and prepared. Amos stared after the scout. Knowing that might make him hesitate, might make him careful, and careful men make mistakes. The next day passed in tense waiting. Scouts spotted movement in the distance, but no direct approach. Vance was positioning his forces, choosing his angle of attack, gathering intelligence. That night, the community ate together in the central clearing. A simple meal, cornmeal mush, dried meat, wild greens Sarah had identified as safe. No one spoke much. Children stayed close to their mothers. Men checked weapons for the dozenth time. After eating, Amos walked the perimeter alone. He checked each defensive position one final time, tested the give of covered pits, examined tripwires for weakness, made tiny adjustments only he would notice. At the northern approach, he knelt and placed one final trap, a simple snare using repurposed chain, positioned where someone leading a charge would step. Not meant to kill, meant to tangle and trip and create chaos at the exact moment when order mattered most. He stood slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in moonlight. His hands that had chopped timber in chains, broken those chains, killed 100 men, built this hidden place, rested at his sides. Amos closed his eyes and spoke quiet words into darkness. Not to God exactly, not to ancestors or spirits, to himself, to the man he'd been, to the man he feared becoming. Give me strength, he whispered, not to kill, but to protect, not to destroy, but to defend what we built. The swamp answered with cricket songs and distant owl calls. Amos opened his eyes and walked back toward the settlement, where Sarah stood waiting with a lantern. Sunrise broke red and angry across the swamp. Amos stood at the northern defensive position, watching fog lift from the water. Behind him, 15 defenders waited in concealed positions. Their breathing came shallow and quick. The attack began without warning. Colonel Vance's forces split into 3 groups. The main body, 20 men, advanced along the northern route, exactly as Amos had predicted. The path looked clear, inviting, safe. They moved in loose formation, rifles ready, eyes scanning the tree line. The first man stepped onto a covered pit. The thin layer of sticks collapsed, and he dropped knee-deep into cold mud, cursing. His companions paused, suddenly cautious. That hesitation cost them. The second rank pressed forward, and 3 more hit pits within seconds of each other. Chaos erupted. Soldiers shouted warnings. Officers barked orders. Men struggled to pull their trapped fellows free. And while they bunched together trying to help, Amos gave the signal. A single bird call. Rifle fire erupted from concealed positions. Not wild spraying, but carefully aimed shots, the way Marcus had trained them. 2 soldiers fell immediately. Others dove for cover behind trees and returned fire, but they couldn't see their targets through the dense undergrowth. Vance's voice cut through the noise, commanding and clear. "Advance by pairs! Use covering fire!" They tried. But every 10 yards brought new problems. Tripwires released counterweighted logs that swung at chest height. Stakes hidden in tall grass caught ankles and shins. The packed earth they trusted suddenly gave way beneath boots. The assault slowed to a crawl. Men moved forward, stopped, retreated, tried again. Each time they pushed ahead, something went wrong. The swamp itself seemed to fight them. From his position, Amos watched it unfold exactly as planned. The terrain was doing most of the work. His people only needed to maintain pressure, keep the enemy off balance, make every step forward feel like a mistake. The eastern and western flanking groups fared worse. Both routes led directly into standing water that looked shallow but dropped suddenly to waist deep. The packed mud beneath turned slippery. Men fell. Equipment got soaked. And when they tried to retreat, they found the paths behind them had flooded even deeper. Marcus's team controlled the eastern position. They let the flanking force commit fully to the flooded path before opening fire. 6 soldiers went down in the first volley. The rest scrambled for cover in water, making themselves perfect targets. "Fall back!" someone screamed. But falling back meant fighting through deep water while defenders shot from solid ground. It became a slaughter. Not hand-to-hand combat. Not heroic charges. Just methodical rifle fire picking off men who couldn't move fast enough to escape. At the western approach, James's defenders employed similar tactics. They'd dammed a small stream the night before. When Vance's western group reached the crossing point, James broke the dam. Water surged through the channel, sweeping 3 men off their feet and scattering the others. The battle fragmented into desperate pockets. Soldiers tried to regroup, but kept hitting new obstacles. Every position they reached turned out to be another trap, another carefully constructed nightmare. Vance himself led the push on the northern route. He was everything the captured scouts said: disciplined, experienced, tactical. He recognized the ambush for what it was and ordered his men to form defensive positions rather than advance blindly. That's when Amos stepped into view. He emerged from the tree line like something from a nightmare. 7 feet of muscle and controlled fury. He carried no rifle, only a length of chain wrapped around his forearms. "Colonel Vance," Amos said quietly. Vance stared at him. The giant himself. 3 soldiers raised rifles. Amos moved before they could fire. He closed the distance impossibly fast for someone his size, swinging the chain in a wide arc. It caught 2 rifles and tore them from their owner's grips. The 3rd soldier got a shot off that went wide. Amos hit him with the chain, wrapped it around his legs, and pulled. The man went down hard. Vance drew his pistol and fired 3 times. Amos dodged the first 2 shots and took the 3rd in his left shoulder. Blood bloomed, but he didn't slow. He grabbed a fallen log, something that would take 2 normal men to lift, and hurled it directly at Vance's position. The colonel rolled aside. His remaining men scattered. And suddenly, Vance found himself alone, separated from his unit, facing Amos in a small clearing. They circled each other. Vance had his pistol. Amos had chain and bare hands. "Your men are dying," Amos said. "Call retreat. I'm an officer of—" "You're a murderer hunting people who want to live free." Amos's voice stayed level. "Call retreat, or I'll break every bone in your body." Vance fired his remaining shots. One hit Amos in the chest, another in the stomach. Neither stopped his advance. Amos closed in, grabbed Vance's wrist, and twisted. The pistol fell. Then Amos hit him, not with full strength, but enough. Vance crumpled. The battle ended within the hour. Vance's forces withdrew in disorder, leaving 12 dead and taking their wounded. The defenders suffered only 3 injuries, none fatal. They'd won completely. They dragged Vance to the settlement's center and bound him to a post. People gathered around, voices excited and relieved. Children laughed. Sarah tended the wounded with a smile on her face. For the first time since the massacre of the 100 hunters, the community felt safe. That evening, Amos interrogated Vance while others celebrated nearby. "How many more are coming?" Amos asked. Vance laughed bitterly. You think this was the real attack? What? 40 men against your fortress swamp. We were never meant to win. Vance met Amos's eyes. We were meant to map your defenses, test your numbers, find your weaknesses. Cold understanding settled over Amos. How many? A full battalion. 200 soldiers with artillery support. They're already marching. Vance smiled without humor. You beat a scouting force. Congratulations. Amos grabbed him by the collar. When? 3 days, maybe 4. Before Amos could ask anything else, Vance's expression changed. His jaw moved strangely. He'd hidden something in his mouth, probably since capture. Poison. His body convulsed once. Blood appeared at the corner of his lips. He died before Sarah could reach him. The celebration died instantly. People crowded around, asking what happened, what he'd said. Amos didn't answer. He just stared at Vance's body, while the truth settled over everything they'd built. Thunder rolled overhead. The first drops of rain began falling. Marcus approached slowly. Amos? Get everyone together, Amos said quietly. We need to tell them. Within minutes, the community gathered in stunned silence as Amos explained. The battle they'd won meant nothing. A much larger force was coming. This settlement, this beautiful, impossible place they'd built together, couldn't withstand 200 trained soldiers. The rain intensified, drumming on makeshift roofs. Lightning flashed across faces frozen in shock and despair. Sarah stood beside Amos, her hand finding his. What do we do? Amos looked at Vance's body, at the people surrounding him, at everything they'd created from nothing. He had no answer. The storm broke fully overhead, washing away the day's victory like it had never happened at all. The rain stopped at dawn. Gray light filtered through broken clouds, illuminating a settlement transformed from fortress to graveyard. Water dripped from cypress branches. Mud sucked at boots. Everything felt heavier than it had the day before. They buried Colonel Vance at the settlement's edge. No ceremony, no words. Just 6 men with shovels digging a hole in soft earth while others watched in silence. Sarah suggested they should say something over the grave, but nobody could find words worth speaking. The man had come to kill them. He died trying. That was all that mattered. Amos didn't attend the burial. He stood at the northern watchtower, staring at nothing. His shoulder and chest wounds had been bandaged, but he barely noticed the pain. Physical hurt was simple, clean. The weight pressing on his chest now had nothing to do with bullet holes. Marcus approached carefully. People are asking what we do next. Amos didn't turn around. Tell them I don't know. They need to hear it from you. Then they'll hear that I don't know. Amos's voice came out flat. I led them here, built this place, told them it was safe, and now 200 soldiers are coming to burn it down. Marcus started to respond, then stopped. He left quietly. The morning passed slowly. People moved through routines without speaking much. Breakfast got cooked and eaten. Children stayed close to their parents. Nobody laughed. The victory from yesterday felt like something that happened years ago, to different people. Amos remained at the watchtower until Sarah climbed up to join him. She carried a canteen and a cloth bundle that smelled like fresh bread. You need to eat, she said. Not hungry. Amos. She set the bundle down between them. Look at me. He didn't move. Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled. He could have resisted easily, but he let her turn him around. She studied his face the way she studied wounds, looking for damage beneath the surface. You think if you surrender it'll save them, she said quietly. Might. It won't. Sarah's voice stayed gentle but firm. The governor wants blood. Vance's death gives him excuse enough to kill everyone here. Woman or child, doesn't matter. They'll call us all insurrectionists and hang anyone they catch. Amos closed his eyes. Then what's the point? We can't fight 200 soldiers. Can't hide from them. Can't. We can run. Running doesn't. Running is surviving. Sarah moved closer. You broke chains and freed people. You built this place from nothing. You won battles that should have been impossible. None of that was cowardice, Amos. None of it. But I brought this down on them. No. Her voice went hard. The system brought this down on us. The same system that enslaved you as a child, that murdered people in convict camps, that sends soldiers to kill families for wanting freedom. She grabbed both his arms. You gave us a chance to fight back. That's not something to feel guilty about. Amos opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked. She'd survived Union field hospitals during the war, watched men die screaming, ended up in a convict camp anyway because helping people wasn't profitable. And here she stood, refusing to break. I don't know how to save them, he admitted. Then we figure it out together. They climbed down from the watchtower and called a meeting. People gathered in the central area, faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Amos stood before them feeling every bit of his size. Too big, too visible, too much of a target. Before he could speak, Elijah stepped forward carrying a leather satchel. Found these in Vance's belongings before we buried him. He spread documents across a table. Official orders on state letterhead. Maps marked with raid locations. Lists of names beside recorded deaths. Letters between the governor and various commanders detailing planned operations. Sarah moved closer, studying the papers. Her eyes widened. This is evidence. Real evidence. Federal authorities could use this to what? Someone called from the crowd. Slap the governor's wrist? Fine him? To open investigations, Sarah said firmly. To expose the convict leasing system. To show the whole country what's happening here. Murmurs spread through the gathering. Hope mixed with skepticism. Amos picked up one of the documents. It detailed Colonel Vance's orders in clean military language. Eliminate resistance elements. Destroy settlement infrastructure. Capture leadership for public execution. The words were precise and bureaucratic, describing mass murder like it was crop rotation. How do we get this north? Amos asked. Sarah met his eyes. We run, tonight. Take everyone who can travel and head for the border. Once we're in federal territory, we present this evidence to authorities who might actually care. The battalion will follow us. Let them try. Marcus stepped forward. We know this swamp better than they do. We can move faster, travel lighter. If we leave before they arrive, they'll be chasing ghosts. What about people who can't travel? Someone asked. Old folks? Young children? We carry them, Amos said quietly. The answer came without thought. We slow down if we have to. But nobody gets left behind. The discussion continued for an hour. Plans formed slowly. Routes got debated. Supply calculations made. Throughout it all, Amos felt something shift inside himself. Not hope exactly, but purpose. They couldn't hold this ground, couldn't win through pure force, but they could move, could adapt, could survive long enough to make their suffering mean something. Running wasn't surrender. It was strategy. By afternoon, the decision was made. They would evacuate at dusk, traveling through the night when tracking would be harder. Each person could carry only essentials. Everything else would be destroyed so the battalion found nothing useful. People scattered to prepare. Amos walked through the settlement, seeing it with new eyes. The watchtower he'd built with Elijah. The medical station Sarah had organized. The communal cooking area where families gathered. The small chapel where Josiah led prayers. A month ago, this had been empty swamp. Now, it was home, and they were going to burn it. The sun moved toward the horizon. People packed food, medicine, weapons, and clothing into bundles they could carry. Children were told to stay quiet. The elderly were assigned helpers. Escape routes got reviewed one final time. Amos stood in the center of it all, watching his people prepare to abandon everything they'd built. Sarah worked beside him, organizing medical supplies with practiced efficiency. "You made the right choice," she said without looking up. "Doesn't feel right. It will. Eventually." Dusk came soft and gray. The first structures went up in flames as planned. Controlled burns that would leave nothing intact for the battalion to use. Smoke rose through the trees, carrying away a month of hope and hard work. Amos took one last look at the settlement, memorized it. Then he turned north and started walking, leading his people into darkness once again. They moved through darkness like smoke through trees, single file, silent. Amos led the way, followed by Marcus and 2 other men who knew the swamp paths. Behind them came families with children, then the elderly supported by younger adults, and finally Sarah with the medical supplies and a rear guard. Nobody spoke unless absolutely necessary. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that noise meant death. The first night passed in measured steps, water up to their knees, branches catching at clothes, the constant soft sounds of breathing and careful footfalls. When dawn threatened, Amos found a dense thicket surrounded by standing water and signaled everyone to hide. They slept in shifts, ate cold food, waited for darkness again. The second night brought them to the swamp's northern edge. Amos held up a hand, and the entire column stopped. He listened for a full minute before moving forward. The transition from swamp to dry ground felt wrong somehow. Too exposed. Too open. They traveled through farmland now, keeping to tree lines and avoiding roads. Twice they heard horses and dropped flat in tall grass until the riders passed. Once they came to a river too deep to wade. Amos studied the water for a long moment, then led them upstream to a fallen tree that formed a natural bridge. Getting everyone across took 2 hours. Old Josiah slipped halfway, and would have fallen if Marcus hadn't grabbed his arm. The preacher whispered thanks that got lost in the sound of rushing water. On the 5th night, they reached the outskirts of a small town. Amos left the group hidden in woods, while he, Marcus, and Elijah approached a farmhouse set back from the main road. Light glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from a chimney. Amos knocked quietly. An elderly black woman opened the door. She took one look at them, and her eyes went wide. "Lord, have mercy. We need help," Amos said simply. She pulled them inside quickly, glancing at the dark road before closing the door. Her name was Ruth. She lived alone since her husband died. She'd heard rumors about something happening south. Stories about a giant man and freed prisoners and burned camps. "They're looking for you," she said, pouring coffee with shaking hands. "Patrol's been through here twice asking questions." "We need supplies," Marcus said. "Food, clean water, medicine if you have it." Ruth nodded. "I can give you what I got, but you can't stay here. Too dangerous." They left an hour later with 4 sacks of supplies and directions to another sympathetic household 2 days north. Ruth refused payment, just pressed Amos's hand and whispered, "You get them people somewhere safe." The pattern repeated over the next week. Careful approaches to isolated houses, quiet conversations, desperate bartering with the little money they had. Most people helped. Some refused. One man threatened to report them until Marcus showed him Vance's documents, and the man's face went pale with understanding. Each day brought new difficulties. A child developed a fever that Sarah treated with herbs traded from a midwife. An old woman's leg gave out and had to be carried. Food ran low until Elijah managed to trade his carpenter's tools for dried meat and cornbread. They moved slower than Amos wanted, faster than seemed possible with so many vulnerable people. The distance between them and the battalion stretched, but never far enough. On the 14th night, they reached Memphis. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River, bigger and noisier than anything most of them had ever seen. Amos left the group camped in woods outside town and entered alone with Elijah and Sarah. They needed passage north, and that meant finding someone willing to risk transporting fugitives. The riverboat district smelled of fish and coal smoke. Steamboats lined the docks, loading and unloading cargo under lantern light. Amos studied each vessel, looking for something specific. Not too large, not too official. A working boat with a crew that might value money more than questions. He found it on the third dock. A cargo steamer named Deliverance, which felt like either good luck or cruel irony. The captain was a scarred white man named Garrett, who eyed them with open suspicion. "What are you hauling?" he asked. "People," Amos said. 43 of them. Need to get north to federal territory." Garrett spat tobacco juice over the rail. "That's so." Amos pulled out everything they had. $12 in coins, a pocket watch, Sarah's medical kit, Elijah's last remaining tools. "That ain't enough," Garrett said. Amos met his eyes without blinking. "It's all we have." Garrett studied them for a long moment. His gaze traveled from Amos's size to Sarah's steady demeanor to Elijah's work-worn hands. Something shifted in his expression. "Y'all the ones they've been hunting?" Amos nodded once. "The giant and the freed prisoners?" Another nod. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed the money back across the railing. "Keep it. You'll need it more than me." He glanced toward his crew. "We leave at dawn. Get your people aboard before then. Stay below deck. Don't make noise. Don't cause trouble." "Why help us?" Sarah asked. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Because I got a daughter who looks at me like I'm worth something, and I want to keep deserving that look." He turned away. "Dawn. Don't be late." They returned to camp and moved everyone through darkness. Getting 43 people onto a riverboat without attracting attention required careful timing and luck. They boarded in small groups, slipping through shadows while dock workers focused on cargo. The last person climbed aboard, just as false dawn lightened the eastern sky. The Deliverance pulled away from the dock as the sun rose. Memphis fell behind them, becoming just another collection of buildings along an endless shoreline. Below deck, the group settled into cramped quarters among cargo crates. It smelled of river water and machine oil, but it felt safer than anywhere they'd been in weeks. Sarah spent the journey moving between people, documenting their stories in a journal she'd acquired in Memphis. Former prisoners described the convict camps. Families recounted raids. Children spoke about parents who didn't make it. Each testimony got recorded in her careful handwriting, transforming suffering into evidence. Elijah organized Vance's documents into categories: orders, correspondence, financial records, death lists. He created a folder that told a complete story of systematic violence sanctioned by the state. Amos stayed near the cargo hold's entrance, watching the shoreline through a gap in the planking. Trees passed slowly. Small towns appeared and vanished. The river carried them north toward something that might be justice, or might be nothing at all. At night, children slept pressed against their mothers. Old folks dozed sitting up. Sarah made rounds, checking wounds and offering quiet reassurance. Amos remained awake, keeping watch over people who'd trusted him with their lives. On the fourth day, the boat's rhythm changed. The engine slowed. Garrett appeared at the hold's entrance. "Coming up on the federal courthouse district. Y'all best get ready." The group gathered their belongings. Amos helped Sarah organize the documents and testimonies into a single package. Elijah made sure everyone understood the plan. Stay together. Stay quiet. Let Amos and Sarah do the talking. The boat bumped against the dock. Footsteps crossed the deck above. Voices called instructions. Amos stood at the threshold, looking at his people. 43 faces watching him, trusting him one more time. He climbed the ladder first, emerged onto the deck, and saw buildings rising beyond the waterfront. Official structures built from stone and brick, places where laws supposedly mattered. He turned back and whispered to the people below, "This is where they stop chasing us." The federal courthouse rose 4 stories above the street, built from gray stone that looked permanent in a way nothing in Mississippi ever had. Amos stood at its base with Sarah and Elijah, staring up at windows that reflected morning light. Behind them, the rest of the group waited in a boarding house 3 blocks away, cramped but safe. "Ready?" Sarah asked. Amos nodded. He carried the documents in a leather satchel Garrett had given them before they disembarked. Everything they needed to prove what happened, everything they'd risked their lives protecting. They climbed marble steps, worn smooth by years of footsteps, pushed through heavy wooden doors into a lobby that smelled of paper and lamp oil. A clerk looked up from his desk, eyes widening slightly at Amos's size. "We need to speak with a federal investigator," Sarah said. Her voice carried the calm authority she'd used in Union Army hospitals. "We have evidence of criminal activity in Mississippi, illegal convict leasing, state-sanctioned violence, murder." The clerk's expression shifted from surprise to sharp attention. "Wait here." He disappeared through a side door. They stood in silence, listening to footsteps echo in distant hallways. Amos felt exposed under the high ceiling, too visible in this official space. His hands wanted to curl into fists, but he kept them loose at his sides. The clerk returned with a middle-aged man in a dark suit. Federal Marshal Thompson introduced himself with a firm handshake and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He led them to an office on the 2nd floor, where morning light slanted through tall windows. "Tell me everything," Thompson said, settling behind his desk. Sarah spoke first, laying out the timeline clearly. The convict leasing camp, Clay Redden's murder plans, Amos's intervention, the bounty hunters, the paramilitary force, their escape north. She presented it like a military report, precise and devastating. Elijah spread Vance's documents across the desk. Orders signed by the governor's office, financial records showing payment for leased labor, correspondence between plantation owners and state officials, lists of prisoners who died in custody, causes of death left blank. Thompson read in silence, his face hardening with each page. When he finished, he looked at Amos directly. "You killed 100 men." It wasn't a question. Amos met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. In self-defense. They came to kill me. Kill all of us. I made sure they couldn't." Thompson leaned back in his chair. "The state of Mississippi has declared you a fugitive murderer. They want you hanged." "I know," Amos said quietly. "But these documents—" Thompson tapped the stack. "If authentic, they prove systematic criminal conspiracy at the highest levels of state government." He looked at Sarah. "You mentioned testimonies?" She pulled out her journal, pages filled with first-hand accounts, names, dates, locations, descriptions of beatings, starvation, deliberate neglect. Thompson read 3 pages and stopped, jaw tight. "I need you to testify under oath," he said. "All of you. Every detail documented and witnessed." They spent the next 4 days in that courthouse. Amos sat in a wooden chair in a formal chamber and answered questions from federal investigators. Yes, he'd been enslaved since childhood. Yes, he'd seen men beaten to death for slowing down. Yes, he'd killed Clay Redden with his bare hands. Yes, he'd do it again. Sarah testified about medical neglect in the camps. Elijah described the financial mechanisms that made convict leasing profitable. Other members of their group came in one by one, telling stories that made the stenographer pause to wipe her eyes. Thompson worked with ruthless efficiency. He brought in document experts who verified the authenticity of Vance's papers. He contacted Union Army officials who confirmed Sarah's service record. He sent telegrams to federal offices across the South, requesting similar evidence. On the 5th day, the story broke in newspapers. Headlines screamed about slavery by another name. Editorial cartoons showed governors in chains. Public outrage spread faster than Amos had thought possible. Within a week, federal marshals raided convict leasing sites across Mississippi. They freed prisoners and arrested overseers. State officials scrambled to distance themselves from documented orders. The governor issued denials that nobody believed. Thompson met with Amos privately. "The state wants your extradition. They're pushing hard." He paused. But federal charges of conspiracy to violate constitutional rights take precedence. And those charges are against them, not you. What does that mean? Amos asked. It means you're not going back. It means we're going to make sure you and your people have somewhere safe to settle. Thompson's expression softened slightly. You broke the law. Multiple laws. But sometimes the law is so broken that breaking it is the only moral choice. The relocation happened quickly. Federal assistance provided train passage to a small town in Pennsylvania, where a Quaker community had agreed to help. Housing, jobs, school for the children, a chance to build normal lives. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south, the battalion finally reached the abandoned swamp settlement. They found empty structures, cold fire pits, and footprints leading nowhere. The commander sent an angry telegram to the governor reporting total failure. The response came back terse and final. Cease operations, return to base. Discuss nothing. Amos's people disappeared into Pennsylvania like water into soil. They took new names, learned new trades, became part of the town's fabric. Some stayed together. Others spread out, seeking their own paths. All of them carried the memory of what they'd survived and what one man had risked to save them. Months passed. Winter came and went. Spring brought warm light and green growth. The town settled into comfortable rhythms that had nothing to do with running or hiding or fighting. Amos found work as a carpenter, his massive hands surprisingly gentle with wood. He built furniture and repaired buildings and helped raise a new schoolhouse. People no longer stared at his size with fear, just polite curiosity that faded when he proved himself quiet and reliable. On a late afternoon in early summer, he sat at a workbench outside the carpentry shop. 3 children surrounded him, watching intently as he demonstrated proper sanding technique. The youngest, a girl maybe 7 years old, held sandpaper awkwardly in both hands. "Like this?" she asked, scrubbing at a pine board. "Slower," Amos said. His voice carried the same patience he used when teaching everything. "Feel the grain. Work with it, not against it." She adjusted her motion, and the wood began to smooth under her small hands. Satisfaction bloomed across her face. Across the yard, Sarah stood in the doorway of the building that served as the community's medical clinic. She watched Amos with the children, a slight smile on her lips. In her hand, she held letters from former camp survivors who'd settled elsewhere, all of them thriving in their own ways. Amos glanced up and caught her watching. Something passed between them, acknowledgement of how far they'd come, how much had changed. He returned his attention to the children, guiding their hands, teaching them to create instead of destroy. The sun lowered toward the horizon, painting everything in golden light. Somewhere far away, people still whispered about the Sentinel, the giant who'd killed 100 hunters and vanished like smoke. The stories grew wilder with each telling, losing accuracy but gaining power. But here, in this moment, Amos was simply a carpenter teaching children to work wood. His smile came easier now, genuine, the kind of expression that transformed his entire face from something intimidating into something almost gentle. He helped the youngest girl smooth the last rough edge from her board. She held it up to the light, examining her work with serious concentration. "Perfect," Amos said quietly. She beamed at him with the uncomplicated joy of a child who'd never known chains, or fear, or the weight of survival. Behind them, the sun touched the horizon, and the day began its slow fade into comfortable darkness. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.